On a scorching August afternoon, I never imagined a single radish could spark a neighborhood war. My name is Harriet Parker, and I'm a retired math teacher who has lived in the same suburban home for nearly 40 years. I've watched kids ride their bikes down my street, neighbors plant flower beds that flourished one year and wither the next, and I've seen countless holiday block parties bring us closer, until recently, that is. The change came in the form of Karen, the newly elected president of our homeowners association. I had heard whispers of her antics, bickering about people's trash cans left out an hour too long, sending threatening letters about garden gnomes that stood half an inch higher than allowed. But I never expected her zeal to affect me, the quiet grandmother who just wanted to grow her own vegetables. I've always had a modest vegetable garden on the side of my house. Nothing fancy. A few tomato plants, bell peppers, lettuce, cucumbers, and the occasional root vegetable. For decades, nobody minded, quite the opposite. Neighbors would greet me with excitement in the summertime, knowing I'd walk around with a basket of extra tomatoes or peppers to share. The air of camaraderie was one of the reasons I stayed in this neighborhood, even as my children grew up and started their own lives out of state. But from the moment Karen took the HOA reins, everything changed. I first met her at our annual HOA meeting, which typically lasted an hour. It was where we discussed upcoming events like the Labor Day barbecue, or made routine decisions about landscaping in the common areas. This time, Karen dominated the discussion from the start. "We need to uphold a certain standard," she said, pacing in front of us in her crisp white blouse. "If we let people run wild with unapproved decorations and landscape changes, our home values will plummet." I try to listen patiently, but her idea of unapproved decorations included a wide variety of normal items. A neighbor's bench with a mosaic pattern, another's whimsical wind chimes, and even my vegetable garden. In fact, one of her bullet points, printed on bright pink paper, read, "No unapproved planting in the front or side yards, including but not limited to vegetables that do not meet the community aesthetic guidelines." After the meeting, I approached her politely and explained that my garden had been there for decades, that the previous HOA presidents had never had an issue, and that my side yard was well maintained. Karen did not respond with understanding. Instead, she offered me a wince that passed for a smile, her lips pressed so tightly they formed a thin line. "We'll need to see proof that the garden was grandfathered in," she said. "Otherwise, you'll have to remove it, or face fines." She then spun around on her kitten heels and disappeared. I'll admit, I shrugged it off at first. After all, I've been part of the community far longer than she had. Surely she'd realize her mistake once she spoke with the other board members or looked at old records. Over the next week, though, I noticed new signs popping up around the neighborhood, courtesy of Karen's zeal. Signs scolding people for parking too close to their own driveways or not wrapping their garbage adequately. It was as though we'd all awakened in a strict boarding school. Things escalated in my case when I received an official-looking letter from the HOA board. The language was formal and foreboding, threatening financial penalties if I did not dismantle my unauthorized vegetable structure. The letter claimed my raised beds and trellises were unsightly and detrimental to neighborhood property values. I laughed a little at first. My so-called structure was just a few wooden frames you could pick up at any gardening store, with some sturdy twine to hold up tomatoes. Still, the letter weighed on my mind as I sat at my kitchen table with my morning coffee. I noticed the bright pink official notice pinned to my door. If I didn't comply, the letter said they would start fining me $50 per day until I removed the vegetable plants. I felt my face grow warm, not from the scorching summer sun, but from disbelief and the stirrings of anger. I reached out to a few neighbors, some of whom knew Karen better than I did. My closest friend on the block, Wendy, had already been on the receiving end of Karen's fines for her wind chimes. Another neighbor, Dan, got a notice about the color of his shed. "She's something else," Wendy commiserated. She tried to tell me the chimes were noise pollution. Mind you, they only tinkle in the slightest breeze. Encouraged by their sympathy, I decided to stand my ground and see if the HOA would come to their senses. After all, I wasn't violating any local health codes, and the garden was kept in neat rows. I'd even installed a small fence around it to keep the local rabbits away. In my eyes, this was a clear case of an overzealous HOA president itching to assert authority. Little did I know, Karen wasn't going to ease up. In fact, she was merely sharpening her claws. Within days, I got another letter, this one detailing the daily fines I'd supposedly accrued, $150 in total, covering 3 days. The letter threatened legal action if I failed to pay or remove the garden within a week. Growing outraged, I rummaged through my old files for the original HOA paperwork from the 1980s, searching for any clause that might prove I had permission or was exempt. But every line was buried under vague jargon and endless amendments. My next step was to contact a friend of mine who had once been on the HOA board, a lovely woman named Lorraine, who'd served as president back in the late 90s. Although she'd moved a few miles away, I hoped she could help me interpret the archaic regulations. When Lorraine read over the new rules, she shook her head in disbelief. "This is nonsense," she said, pointing at the pink notices. "She's misusing the guidelines. Where does she think she has the power to ban vegetables? There's no new legislation or local ordinance that backs her up." Her words gave me confidence, but little did I realize Karen's next move would push our conflict to a downright absurd level. She believed she had found the perfect weapon. If I wouldn't remove my illegal vegetables, she'd find a way to involve the local authorities. And that was just the beginning of the madness. The standoff started quietly, but soon became the talk of our entire subdivision. Over the next several days, each new morning brought a new notice pinned to my door or mailbox, each letter more threatening than the last. Some used bolder fonts, others underlined key phrases like final warning or legal liability. It felt ludicrous, but as a rule-following former teacher, I found it impossible to ignore. Though I'd retired from grading exams, the dread of official letters still triggered that old sense of needing to follow instructions. Only, this time, the rules made no sense. I tried taking a diplomatic approach. I collected photographs of my garden over the years, proving its long-standing presence. I included testimonials from neighbors who appreciated the fresh vegetables. I even added a short letter from a local horticulture society praising my exemplary home garden. I put it all in a neat folder and hand-delivered it to Karen's mailbox, attaching a note politely requesting that the HOA reconsider my case and waive these ridiculous fines. For nearly 2 weeks, I heard nothing. The daily fines kept accumulating on paper, $1.50 a day that Karen claimed would be due at the end of the month. But I thought maybe, just maybe, my evidence had softened her stance. Then, on a bright Saturday morning, I glanced out my window to see a police cruiser parked in front of my house. My heart lurched. At first, I thought maybe there was some emergency on our street. I dashed to my front door, flung it open, and found Karen standing there with 2 officers on the sidewalk. "This is the house," she announced to them, jabbing a finger toward my front yard. "She's violating our association rules, and I want an official report. I'm not leaving until she gets a citation." A long moment passed while my mind scrambled to process. A citation for what? Growing vegetables? I tried to compose myself, stepping onto the porch with all the calm I could muster. The police officers looked more than a little uncomfortable. One of them, Officer Hayes, cleared his throat. "Ma'am," he said, addressing Karen, "we've already explained that a dispute over HOA rules typically isn't a police matter." Karen's face twitched with annoyance. "It's not just an HOA rule," she insisted, a triumphant gleam in her eyes. "She's violating city code about unapproved structures and obstructing the sidewalk." Incredulous, I motioned for the officers to follow me around the side of the house. If I hadn't been so flabbergasted, I might have laughed. My garden was behind a short picket fence, a good 5 feet from the sidewalk. There was plenty of room for anyone to pass, including strollers or people in wheelchairs. "You see," I said, turning to the officers, "there's no obstruction here. And as far as I know, our city code doesn't forbid having a vegetable garden on private property." Officer Hayes looked at his partner, then shrugged. "Ma'am," he said, addressing me this time, "there doesn't appear to be any violation under city code that I can see." We responded because Ms. Klein, that was Karen's surname, called 911, alleging a neighborhood disturbance. "But it appears to be a private HOA issue." My mouth fell open. She had called 911 for a vegetable garden? Karen's eyes flashed with anger. So, you're telling me you're not going to write her a ticket? This is an egregious violation of our community standards. The second officer, more stoic, slowly shook his head. Community standards aren't the same as city laws, ma'am. If you have a civil dispute, you can handle it through the HOA's legal channels. But please don't call 911 again for non-emergency matters. He glanced at Karen with a stern warning in his eyes. Well, Karen huffed, spinning on her heel and marching back to her SUV, which was parked diagonally across my driveway. The officers gave me polite nods and quietly left. I took a moment, leaning against my picket fence, letting the absurdity sink in. This woman had actually called the emergency line on me over tomatoes and cucumbers. What next? A National Guard deployment? Word of the incident spread quickly. Neighbors stopped by to check on me, some outraged, others shaking their heads in disbelief. One elderly couple down the street, Doris and Robert, expressed their frustration. She's gone too far, Doris said, voice trembling with indignation. What if there's a real emergency somewhere and 911 lines are tied up with petty HOA complaints? I appreciated the support, but I also felt uneasy. Karen wasn't letting up, and my fines were supposedly ballooning by the day. So I called my daughter, Ellen, who lives a few states away. She was incredulous. Mom, this is insane, she said over the phone. Have you tried contacting a lawyer? My initial reaction was to dismiss the idea. Hiring a lawyer over a home garden felt ridiculous. But each letter I received from the HOA had begun to threaten more serious consequences. Property liens, potential lawsuits, and other legal jargon designed to scare me into submission. Karen was the type who thrived on intimidation, and I realized she might be willing to take this as far as she could. If I folded, I would lose my beloved garden. If I fought, I risked a protracted legal battle. Reluctantly, I started making calls. I found a local attorney named Sandra Green, known for handling property disputes, particularly those involving HOAs. She sounded sympathetic when I explained my plight over the phone. You'd be surprised how often power-tripping HOA presidents escalate minor issues, she said. I'll be happy to review the association documents and see if there's a valid reason for these fines, or if they're in clear violation of your rights as a homeowner. Meanwhile, Karen's warpath continued. She took pictures of my garden at random times of day, or I'd see her standing on the sidewalk, arms crossed, glaring at my lettuce patch as though it might leap out and attack her. She posted signs on the community bulletin board at the clubhouse, warning neighbors about unapproved horticulture projects. Several neighbors told me she was on a tirade about removing eyesores before they lowered property values. I guess decades of a tidy, well-maintained garden were meaningless compared to Karen's personal vendetta. Though it pained me to do so, I try to keep my interactions with her minimal, leaving any direct contact up to my newly hired attorney. Sandra Green promptly sent Karen and the HOA board a letter requesting proof that my garden specifically violated some legitimate code or covenant. It gave me a small spark of hope, imagining Karen's face when she saw the official letterhead. But I also knew this was just the start. Karen wouldn't bow out gracefully. If anything, receiving that lawyer's letter might spur her to escalate even further. And escalate she did. A week later, I found myself staring at an envelope with the HOA's logo, my heart pounding. Inside was a formal notice of a hearing scheduled for next Tuesday evening in the community clubhouse. The hearing, the letter read, was to determine the appropriate penalties for my willful disregard of the HOA's landscaping rules. My attendance was strongly recommended. Strongly recommended, like I had any choice. Sandra Green, my attorney, urged me to attend and present the facts. They're likely trying to scare you, she said over the phone. Show up with documentation. We'll make a clear case that the garden is not a violation, and if they insist on fining you, we'll challenge it. It all felt so surreal. Never in my life had I been summoned to something that sounded so much like a judicial hearing, especially over a few rows of tomatoes. Nevertheless, I gathered all my materials, photos spanning decades, letters from old HOA board members, Even a short statement from a neighbor with a landscaping background who verified my raised beds were safe and compliant with city regulations. Sandra would accompany me and speak on my behalf if needed. I just prayed that the rest of the board members would be more rational than their president. When the day of the hearing arrived, I walked into the clubhouse with my chin held high, but my stomach twisted in knots. A small group of neighbors stood outside the meeting room, offering me encouraging smiles. Inside, the panel of 5 HOA board members sat behind a long table. Karen was at the center, wearing a blazer that looked a size too tight, her expression as severe as ever. Sandra and I took seats in front of the table, reminiscent of a job interview gone awry. Karen cleared her throat. "The purpose of this hearing," she began, "is to address Ms. Parker's blatant violations of our community guidelines. We have documented evidence of unauthorized vegetable plants, unsightly trellises, and disregard for the new landscaping regulations established earlier this year." She gestured to a neat stack of papers on the table. Sandra leaned forward. "With all due respect, we dispute the notion that Ms. Parker's garden is unauthorized. It predates any new landscaping regulations by several decades. We have evidence here to prove it." Karen's eyes flicked to the other board members. 3 of them exchanged uncertain glances. One, a man named Gil, spoke up. "Yes, Harriet's garden has been there for as long as I can remember. I don't see why it's an issue all of a sudden. It's well kept and hardly an eyesore." At that, Karen's lips pursed. "Whether or not it's well kept isn't the point. We have new standards. The board voted to disallow vegetable gardens in visible areas to maintain a cohesive look. If we let Harriet keep hers, we have to let everyone keep theirs. And soon, we'll have who knows what cornstalks, scarecrows, or entire backyard farms in full view." I felt my temper spark. "There's nothing wrong with vegetables, Karen. People find them quite lovely, and they provide fresh food. Why is a tomato plant any worse than a rose bush?" She glared at me. "Because we have rules, Harriet, and rules must be followed." Sandra stepped in, calmly laying out official documents. "Your so-called rules were voted on without proper homeowner notice. The previous covenants don't ban vegetable gardens. You can't just start fining Ms. Parker retroactively for something that was allowed for decades." For a moment, the board members quietly flipped through the stack Sandra had brought. Karen's face turned red at the mention of improper procedure. She stammered, "It wasn't retroactive. We gave her notice." Gil raised a hand. "Karen, the notice was sent after Harriet was already growing this season's vegetables. And there's no documentation to show the board conducted an official, properly announced vote to ban pre-existing gardens. Honestly, I don't see how we can penalize her. It doesn't seem right." Another board member, Celia, looked thoughtful. "Even if we were to ask Harriet to remove it next season, I'm not convinced we can legally enforce a daily fine on something that was never explicitly banned before. Perhaps we need to revisit these guidelines altogether." That was the moment Karen's eyes flickered with panic. She seemed to sense she was losing support. "Listen," she snapped. "We have to maintain standards. Home values depend on it. If Harriet or anyone else wants to grow vegetables, they can keep them in their backyard, behind a fence where no one can see." "But my backyard is heavily shaded by oaks," I explained. "The side yard is the only area that gets consistent sun. I'm not destroying healthy trees just because the sun isn't shining in the back." The tension in the room soared. I could practically feel Karen's desperation. She had brought me here expecting a quick condemnation, but the other board members weren't willing to follow her blindly. Sandra then calmly outlined the potential legal ramifications of wrongfully fining me. She mentioned that if we had to, we would file for an injunction to stop the fines and possibly seek reimbursement for legal fees. A hush fell over the board. Gil and Celia flipped through the documents one last time, then quietly nodded to each other. The other 2 members looked uneasy but didn't voice any support for Karen's hardline stance. Finally, Gil cleared his throat. "Karen, I think we need to hold off on this. The board should review the guidelines thoroughly. Meanwhile, Ms. Parker's fines should be suspended until we have a definitive ruling." Karen's face looked like it was about to explode. "Fine," she hissed through clenched teeth. "We'll suspend it. Temporarily." She smacked her gavel on the table with unnecessary force. Meeting adjourned. Sandra and I exchanged relieved smiles. It wasn't a complete victory yet, but it was something. The immediate threat of those daily fines would go away, at least for the time being. After the hearing, a few neighbors who had quietly observed approached me and shook my hand, offering words of encouragement. Karen stormed out without another word, leaving in a hurry. But I knew Karen wouldn't stop there. She was embarrassed in front of the board, and that kind of person rarely backs down gracefully. If anything, I suspected she'd redouble her efforts to paint me as a menace. The real question was how far she'd go, and whether the rest of the HOA would stand with her or finally rein her in. Little did I realize I was about to get my answer far sooner, and in a far more dramatic fashion than I ever could have guessed. In the days that followed the hearing, life settled into an uneasy calm. Sandra assured me that legally, Karen and the HOA had a weak case, and I should continue tending my garden as normal. Some neighbors began stopping by more often, picking up fresh produce. Others offered to help if things escalated again. I felt touched by their support, yet always kept an eye out for Karen's SUV prowling the block. One late afternoon, I was kneeling in the soil, carefully tying my tomato vines to their stakes, when I heard a commotion out front. Voices shouted, and a car engine revved loudly. Concerned, I wiped my hands on my apron and hurried to the driveway. There, I found a sight that nearly made me drop my garden shears. Karen, her SUV parked with a trunk loaded with wooden stakes, signage, and, believe it or not, orange plastic fencing, the kind used at construction sites. She was red-faced, furious, and flanked by two men who appear to be day laborers. "What on earth?" I gasped. Karen marched over, brandishing a rolled-up poster. "We're putting up a barrier," she announced, voice shaking with rage. "You refuse to remove your illegal garden, so the HOA board is doing it for you. This orange fencing will mark the boundary of what's allowed and what's not. We'll forcibly remove anything that crosses into the visible yard zone." My cheeks burned with indignation. "You can't just trespass on my property and do this. The board didn't approve it. I was just at the hearing." She waved the poster in my face, revealing a single signature at the bottom. Hers. "I'm the president, and it's an emergency action. Don't try to stop me." The two men she'd hired looked skeptical, glancing from me to her, uncertain whether they should actually start driving stakes into my lawn. One of them murmured, maybe we should see some paperwork first." Karen shot him a glare. "On the paperwork? Now do it." Alarmed, I pulled out my phone. "Then I guess I'll have to call the police for trespassing, since you didn't learn your lesson the first time you dialed 911 on me." I began dialing, my heart hammering so loudly I could barely hear. This situation was beyond surreal. Before I could hit call, Wendy and Dan, my neighbors, came rushing over. "What is going on here?" Wendy demanded. She stepped between Karen and me, arms crossed protectively. Dan snapped pictures with his phone, capturing Karen's temper tantrum. Karen let out a derisive laugh. "You're all insane. I'm saving our property values. You'll thank me when your home sells for top dollar because there aren't ridiculous radishes in the side yard next door." Dan lowered his phone, eyebrows knitted in disbelief. "You sound ridiculous, Karen. Vegetables aren't going to tank anyone's home value. This is her yard, and you can't just confiscate it." "Watch me," Karen snapped. She turned to the two hired workers and shouted, "Start putting up the fence. Now." They hesitated, eyeing the small crowd forming on the sidewalk. A few more neighbors had arrived, drawn by the shouting. "I don't think this is legal, ma'am," said one of the workers, stepping back. "We didn't sign up for." Karen grabbed a roll of the plastic fence. "Oh, for heaven's sake, I'll do it myself." She stomped onto my lawn, hammered the first wooden stake in the ground, quite crookedly, and began threading the fence through it. Wendy gasped and tried to intervene, but I put a hand on her shoulder. I knew if we physically stopped Karen, she'd likely spin the story to claim assault or some other nonsense. Instead, I quickly followed through with my call to the police, this time for a valid emergency. Within minutes, a patrol car turned the corner. The same officer as before, Officer Hayes, stepped out. He looked exasperated when he saw Karen. "We meet again," he said dryly. Karen straightened up, her face glistening with sweat. "Officer, I'm enforcing HOA rules. This garden is illegal, and we have the right to remove it." Officer Hayes looked from her to me. "Ma'am," he said to Karen, "if the HOA has legal authority, they can proceed after a civil judgment. But you don't have the right to trespass on her property and start erecting fences. You need a court order, or at the very least a board-approved measure, which this does not appear to be." "She's ignoring the rules," Karen bellowed, her voice cracking. "It's an eyesore, and I'm tired of looking at it every time I drive by." She stomped her foot like a petulant child. The officer raised an eyebrow. "That might be your personal opinion, but that doesn't make it a legal matter. Right now, you're trespassing. I'm going to ask you, and anyone you hired, to leave Ms. Parker's property immediately." Karen glared at me, chest heaving. Then she rounded on Officer Hayes. "So you're saying I can't do anything? That she gets to keep this disgusting vegetable patch forever?" Officer Hayes sighed. "That's a matter for the civil courts or the HOA's internal process, which apparently is still unresolved. But if you don't step off her property right now, I'll have to charge you with trespassing." It was a standoff. Neighbors stared, cameras recording on their phones. Karen's face went through a wild array of expressions: shock, rage, frustration, even fear. Then, perhaps realizing she was on the brink of a criminal charge, she spun around, kicked at the orange fencing, and stormed back to her SUV. "This isn't over," she yelled. "I'll see you in court." She sped away, leaving the 2-day laborers behind, who quickly apologized before jogging off down the street. Exhausted, I sank onto my porch steps. Winnie crouched down beside me, giving me a reassuring pat on the back. Officer Hayes paused long enough to make sure Karen was gone before walking over. "Ms. Parker," he said gently, "you might want to file a restraining order if this continues. She's clearly out of line. I'll note everything in my report." "Thank you, officer," I replied, my voice shaky. "I really appreciate it." As the sun set, the small group of neighbors helped me remove the lone, crooked stake Karen had driven into my lawn. It felt like an odd exorcism, removing the physical embodiment of her toxic attempt to control me. I was grateful for everyone's help, and as we finished, we chatted about how insane the entire episode had been. I wish I could say that was the end of the saga, but even if Karen never physically set foot on my property again, she tried other tactics, spreading rumors, whining at every board meeting, attempting to get new rules passed. However, the backlash from her outrageous antics was fierce. More and more neighbors rallied to my side. Some even wrote letters to the local paper about HOA tyranny, calling for a reevaluation of the board's authority. In the midst of it all, I discovered a renewed sense of community. People I barely knew before started defending me, sharing their own frustrations with intrusive HOAs and misguided individuals like Karen. It turned out many folks loved the idea of a fresh vegetable garden and thought it was high time we replaced strict ornamental lawns with something more sustainable. By the time everything was said and done, Karen's reputation was in tatters, and she eventually resigned as HOA president under pressure from everyone fed up with her reign of terror. As for my garden, it thrives to this day, still bursting with tomatoes, cucumbers, peppers, and even those criminal radishes. The silver lining of this ordeal was that it connected me to my neighbors in ways I never expected. Together, we learned that sometimes the best way to handle an entitled bully is to stand firm, rely on each other, and not let fear trump common sense. And whenever I pick a fresh tomato now, I can't help but smile, remembering the day the illegal vegetables triumphed over the ultimate HOA Karen. The end.